The wrench hit the concrete so hard the sound rang off every wall in White's Auto Repair, a single metallic note that dropped the whole shop into silence. Thomas Mitchell stood there with his hands empty, oil still wet on his knuckles, and every man on that floor knew what was coming before the words even landed. Deborah White walked out of her office with a coffee mug in one hand and a clipboard in the other, her jaw set the way it got when she'd decided someone's day was about to get worse. She stopped 10 feet from Thomas and looked at him like he'd just cost her something she couldn't get back. "Tell me you charged that woman." Thomas wiped his hands on a shop rag, slow and deliberate. The kind of slow that buys you 3 seconds to decide if you're going to make this easy or make it true. "I didn't." The shop stayed quiet. Robert Williams stood by Bay 3 pretending to check a torque spec he already knew by heart. Brandon Flores, the new kid who'd been there all of 6 weeks, found something fascinating about the tire rack on the far wall. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be part of what was about to happen, but nobody could look away either. Deborah set the coffee mug down on the nearest workbench, careful, like she was giving herself one more second to decide if she really wanted to do this. Then she looked at Thomas again, and the decision was already made. "You know what that costs me? She's an elderly woman. Car was unsafe. She needed the work. I don't care if she needed a kidney transplant. Parts cost money. Your time costs money. This isn't a charity, Thomas. I'll pay for the parts out of my check." "That's not the point." Deborah's voice went flat, the kind of flat that meant the conversation was already over and she was just filling in the rest for the audience. "The point is, you do this every time someone walks in here looking sad enough. You think that builds a business? You want to know why I can't give you the raise you asked for 3 months ago? This. Right here. This is why." Thomas looked at her and didn't say anything for a beat. Then, "Your margins are thin because you charged Mrs. Gomez $400 for a job that should have been $250. She told half the neighborhood. Farrington's Auto down on Maple has been taking our regulars ever since." Deborah's face went tight. "You do not get to lecture me about my own shop." "I'm not lecturing. I'm telling you what I see. What you see." She picked up the clipboard, looked at it like it had an answer she needed, then set it back down. "What you see is a man who thinks his personal code matters more than how business actually works. And I've carried that for 12 years, Thomas. 12 years of you deciding which rules apply to you and which ones don't. I've had enough." The air in the shop changed. Robert stopped pretending to work and just stood there. Brandon took a half step back like he didn't want to be standing too close when the hammer came down. Deborah straightened her shoulders. "You're done. Pack your tools. Turn in your keys. Whatever you've got in your locker, take it now." Thomas didn't move right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone when he's already calculated the whole thing and decided there's nothing left here worth fighting for. Then he nodded once, small, the kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement. It just means the conversation's over. He walked to his toolbox and started pulling out the drawers. Ratchets first, then sockets, then the good 3/8 drive he'd bought in 1998 when he still thought working at one place for 20 years would mean something. The sound of metal sliding into the canvas bag was the only noise in the shop. Nobody spoke. Robert looked at the floor. Brandon looked at the wall. Deborah stood there with her arms crossed, watching. Thomas took the last drawer out and set it on the workbench. He went to his locker and pulled the door open. Inside was a pair of work gloves, a half-empty bottle of Advil, and a photograph taped to the inside of the door. The photograph showed a younger version of Thomas standing next to Linda at his vocational school graduation. She had her arm around his shoulders, and she was smiling the way people smile when they're genuinely proud of someone and don't need to hide it. Thomas peeled the tape off carefully, folded the photo once, and slid it into his shirt pocket. He zipped the tool bag shut, picked up his jacket from the hook on the wall, walked to the front desk where Darren sat pretending to look at his phone. Thomas set his shop keys on the counter, metal on laminate. No sound of anger, no sound of anything. Just the quiet click of a man putting something down that used to be his. He looked at Robert. Robert finally looked back. Didn't say anything, but his face said enough. Then Thomas looked at Brandon, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the wall. Thomas gave him a nod, small, the kind of nod that says it's not your fault. Then he walked out the front door into the Wednesday morning light and stood on the sidewalk for a second, listening. Traffic on Jefferson Avenue. A dog barking 2 blocks over. The distant hum of the highway. The world kept moving like nothing had just ended, which was how the world worked when something ended for you, but not for anybody else. Thomas shifted the tool bag on his shoulder and started walking. 4 blocks later he stopped. Not because the bag got too heavy, though it was heavy. Not because his legs gave out, though at 58 his knees didn't appreciate the walk. He stopped because he passed a bus bench in front of a dry cleaner and he needed to sit down and be honest with himself before he kept going. He set the bag on the ground between his boots and sat. The bench was cold through his jeans. The morning had that April crispness that felt good for about 10 minutes and then reminded you that you should have brought a better jacket. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and looked at the screen. No missed calls, no messages, just a calendar reminder he'd set himself 3 days ago. Emily tuition due, 6 weeks. He stared at that reminder for a long time. Then he put the phone away and stared at the traffic. 12 years at White's. He'd started there when Linda first got the diagnosis, back when they thought it was manageable, back when the word cancer still felt like something that happened to other people. He'd taken the job because it was close enough to home that he could check on her during lunch breaks. He'd stayed because the work was steady, and steady mattered when everything else in your life was falling apart in slow motion. And now he was sitting on a bus bench at 58 years old with a tool bag and no job, and a niece who had 6 weeks before $18,000 came due. The math was simple. $22,000 in savings. $18,000 for Emily's tuition. $4,000 left to live on while he found another shop that would hire a man his age. Except most shops didn't hire men his age. They hired 25-year-olds who could work 12-hour shifts without their backs giving out, who didn't need reading glasses to see the fine print on a diagnostic screen, who didn't remember when cars had carburetors and didn't care. He thought about calling Emily, thought about telling her what happened, thought about how she'd try to hide the worry in her voice and how he'd try to hide the worry in his, and how they'd both sit there on opposite ends of a phone line being careful with each other. He thought about going back to White's, thought about walking back through that door and telling Deborah he was sorry, that he'd pay for the parts, that it wouldn't happen again. He'd seen her take people back before. The trick was to go back humble, go back small, swallow whatever made you stand up in the first place and replace it with something easier for her to manage. He sat with that idea for about 30 seconds. Then he picked up the tool bag and stood. No, not that. He started walking again, heading east on Jefferson toward the small house he'd shared with Linda for 16 years before the cancer took her and left him with mortgage payments and a quiet he still wasn't used to. The walk took 20 minutes. His knee started complaining around minute 12, but he ignored it. At 58, you learn to ignore a lot of things your body tried to tell you. He got home at 10:15. The house was a small 2-bedroom ranch with white siding that needed painting and a driveway that needed resurfacing. Linda used to keep flowers in the front beds, but Thomas had let that go after she died. Not because he didn't care. Because every time he looked at the empty beds, he remembered her kneeling there in her garden gloves and remembering hurt more than the absence did. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the living room. The house smelled like coffee and old wood, and the faint trace of the lavender soap Linda used to buy in bulk because it was cheaper that way. Her photo was still on the mantel. Thomas looked at it every time he walked in and every time he walked out, a habit he'd built without meaning to. The photo showed Linda at 34 standing on a beach in Maine, smiling at the camera like the person behind it was the only thing in the world worth smiling at. She'd been gone 6 years, but the photo was still the first thing he saw when he came home. He set the tool bag down by the door and went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator and stared into it without taking anything out. The fridge had the basics: milk, eggs, deli meat, leftover chicken from 2 nights ago. The kind of inventory that belonged to a man who ate to function and didn't think much beyond that. He closed the fridge and pulled his phone out again. Thought about calling Emily. Thought about calling Robert. Thought about calling his sister in Oregon who'd been telling him for 3 years to move out there and start over. He didn't call any of them. Instead, he opened the browser and searched for jobs. Mechanic positions within 20 miles. The results came back sparse. 2 listings at a dealership 30 minutes west. 1 listing at a tire shop that paid $12 an hour, which was less than he'd made 15 years ago. 1 listing at a place called Farrington's Auto that didn't list a wage but said experienced technicians preferred. He saved the Farrington's listing and closed the browser. Then he just stood there in his kitchen looking at the counter, at the coffee maker Linda had bought in 2011, at the stack of mail he hadn't opened yet, at the window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard where the grass was getting long. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail because he was tired and his shoulder hurt from the tool bag and he'd already had enough surprises for one morning. But he answered anyway because that was what you did when you didn't have a job. You answered every call in case it was something that mattered. Hello? Mr. Mitchell? A woman's voice. Older. Not a voice he recognized. Speaking. My name is Margaret Wilson. I believe you helped me this morning at White's Auto Repair. Thomas went still. He set his other hand on the counter to steady himself, even though he wasn't unsteady. Yes, ma'am. I did. I wanted to thank you properly, and I was hoping we could meet. Would you be available tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock? Thomas looked at the empty kitchen, at the photo of Linda on the mantel visible through the doorway, at the tool bag sitting by the front door like a silent accusation. Yes, ma'am. I'm available. Wonderful. My address is 847 Oakwood Drive. It's a small colonial with a blue door. You can't miss it. I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'll see you tomorrow. The call ended. Thomas stood in his kitchen holding the phone and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The old woman from this morning, the one with the Honda Accord and the forgotten wallet that wasn't actually forgotten, wanted to meet with him, at her home, tomorrow. He opened the browser again and searched for Margaret Wilson. The first result was an obituary from 2019. William Garcia, 62, founder of Garcia Industrial Supply, passed away April 14th after a brief illness. He is survived by his wife, Margaret Wilson Garcia, and numerous colleagues who considered him a mentor and friend. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the Westfield Scholarship Fund, which William and Margaret established in 2003 to support students pursuing skilled trades. Thomas read the obituary twice. Then he searched for Garcia Industrial Supply. The company website was simple, professional, clearly maintained. Mid-size operation, not huge, not small. They supplied hardware and industrial equipment to contractors across 3 counties. The About page had a photo of William Garcia standing in front of a warehouse, late 50s, work boots, hands in his pockets. The caption underneath said, "Founded 1987, built on the principle that honest work deserves honest service." Thomas closed the browser and set the phone on the counter. He walked to the living room and sat on the couch, the same couch he and Linda had bought at a furniture outlet in 2008, and he tried to think clearly about what he knew and what he didn't. He knew Margaret Wilson had come to White's not entirely by accident. Maybe the car noise was real. Maybe it wasn't. But people with money had people for that kind of thing. They didn't drive 20-year-old Hondas to a shop on Jefferson Avenue on a Wednesday morning unless there was something they were looking for that couldn't be outsourced. He knew she'd watched him work. He'd felt it. That particular quality of attention from the waiting area, the kind you feel on the back of your neck when someone isn't pretending to read a magazine. He knew she'd set up the wallet moment, had to be intentional. The wallet had been there. He'd seen the outline against the leather. She wanted to see what he'd do, whether he'd let her walk away with dignity or whether he'd push the transaction and make her feel small. What he didn't know was what she'd seen in him that was worth a phone call and a meeting at her home. He wasn't special. He was a mechanic who'd done a decent thing on an ordinary morning. He'd done decent things before, and they'd cost him before, and he'd done them anyway, because that was how Linda had raised him to be and how he'd stayed even after she was gone. He sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the wall, at the shadows the afternoon light made through the window blinds. Then he got up and went to the kitchen and made himself a sandwich because it was past noon and he hadn't eaten, and at 58 you didn't skip meals just because your day had gone sideways. He ate standing at the counter, turkey and Swiss on wheat bread, the same lunch he'd been making for himself for 6 years, because it was cheap and it filled the space and he didn't have to think about it. After he ate, he went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers, still dressed, and closed his eyes. He didn't expect to sleep, but his body had other ideas. He woke up at 3:47 according to the clock on the nightstand, disoriented for a few seconds about where he was and why he was home in the middle of the afternoon. Then he remembered, and the weight of the day settled back onto his chest. He got up and went to the bathroom and splashed water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror. 58 years old, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. Gray coming in at his temples that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The face of a man who'd worked with his hands for 34 years and had the scars and calluses to prove it, not old, not young. Somewhere in the middle where people stopped seeing you as potential and started seeing you as overhead. He went back to the kitchen and made coffee because coffee was something to do and doing something was better than sitting still. While the coffee brewed, he pulled out his phone and called Emily. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, bright and measured. "Hey, this is Emily. Leave a message and I'll call you back." He hung up without leaving a message. Didn't know what to say yet. Didn't want to worry her before he had a plan. He poured the coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of mail he'd been ignoring for 3 days. Bills, mostly. Electric, water, property tax statement, a flyer from a gutter cleaning company, a credit card offer. Nothing that couldn't wait. He thought about tomorrow morning, about driving to 847 Oakwood Drive and knocking on Margaret Wilson's blue door and sitting across from a woman he didn't know and hearing whatever it was she wanted to say. He thought about what Linda would tell him if she were here. She'd tell him to go. She'd tell him to listen. She'd tell him that sometimes the universe puts something in your path and you don't question it, you just see where it leads. Linda had believed in that kind of thing. Signs, timing, the idea that things happened for reasons even when the reasons didn't make sense until later. Thomas hadn't believed in it the same way, but he'd believed in Linda, and believing in her meant taking seriously the things she took seriously. He finished the coffee and rinsed the cup and set it in the dish rack. Then he went to the small desk in the corner of the living room and pulled out a notebook and a pen. He wrote down what he knew. Margaret Wilson, widow. Husband founded Garcia Industrial Supply. Husband died 2019. She drives a 2003 Honda Accord. She came to White's on purpose. She tested me. She called me afterward. Under that he wrote, "Meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., 847 Oakwood. Listen, don't assume. Don't hope too hard." That last line he underlined twice. The rest of the afternoon passed slow. He tried to watch television but couldn't focus. Tried to read a book he'd started 3 weeks ago but couldn't remember what had happened in the previous chapter. Tried to organize the garage but got halfway through and gave up because organizing the garage wasn't going to change anything about tomorrow. At 6:30 he made dinner. Chicken breast, rice, frozen broccoli. The same meal he'd made 100 times because it was simple and it worked. He ate at the kitchen table with the television on in the other room for noise, some show about people renovating houses in places he'd never been. After dinner he washed the dishes and put them away and stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard in the failing light. The grass really was too long. He'd have to mow this weekend, add it to the list of things that didn't matter right now but would matter eventually. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Text from Emily. "Sorry I missed your call. Everything okay?" He typed back, "Everything's fine. Just wanted to check in. How's school?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Busy but good. Big exam Friday. How's work?" Thomas stared at the question for 10 seconds. Then he typed, "Work's fine. Don't worry about me. Focus on your exam." "You sure?" "I'm sure. Love you." "Love you too." He set the phone on the counter and stood there feeling the lies sit heavy in his chest. He'd tell her. Just not tonight. Not before he knew what tomorrow morning meant. He went to bed at 9:30, which was early for him, but he didn't have anywhere to be, and lying in bed staring at the ceiling was the same as sitting on the couch staring at the wall except horizontal. He lay there thinking about Margaret Wilson and William Garcia and Garcia Industrial Supply, and what kind of woman drove a broken-down Honda when her late husband had founded a successful company. He thought about the way she'd held her purse with both hands in the waiting area, the way she'd squinted at the intake form, the way she'd said, "I feel like such a nuisance," in a voice that suggested she'd spent a long time learning how not to be one. He thought about Deborah White and the wrench hitting the concrete and the silence that followed. He thought about Robert's face when he walked out, thought about Brandon looking at the floor, thought about 12 years of waking up at 5:30 and driving to the same shop and doing the same work for the same woman who'd just told him he was done. He thought about Emily and the $18,000 and the $4,000 that would be left after he paid it, and how long a man could make $4,000 last while looking for work at 58. He thought about Linda, about the beach in Maine, about the way she used to say, "Things happen for a reason, Tommy," whenever something went wrong, about how he'd never fully believed her but had wanted to, because believing her meant believing the world had a plan, even when the plan looked like chaos. Somewhere around 11, he fell asleep. He woke at 6:15 to gray light through the bedroom window and the distant sound of someone's lawnmower already running. He lay there for a minute, letting his back settle, letting his knee remember it was supposed to bend. Then he got up and went through the morning routine. Shower, shave, coffee, toast. He dressed in the cleanest jeans he had and a button-down shirt that Linda had bought him 4 Christmases ago, blue with thin white stripes. He looked at himself in the mirror and decided he looked like a man trying to look presentable without trying too hard, which was about as good as it was going to get. He left the house at 9:30. The drive to 847 Oakwood took 12 minutes. The neighborhood was older, tree-lined, houses built in the 60s and 70s with big yards and detached garages. Not wealthy, not poor. The kind of neighborhood where people stayed for 30 years and raised their kids and retired and died, and their kids sold the house to someone else who'd do the same thing. 847 was a small colonial with white siding and a blue door, exactly like Margaret had said. The lawn was mowed. The flower beds had mulch. A Honda Accord sat in the driveway, the same silver 2003 he'd fixed yesterday. He parked on the street and checked his phone. 9:52, 8 minutes early. He sat in the truck and waited. At 9:58 he got out and walked to the front door, pressed the doorbell, heard it chime inside, 2 notes, pleasant and ordinary. The door opened. Margaret Wilson stood there in a cardigan and slacks, her white hair pinned back, her face composed and kind. She looked at Thomas and smiled, small but genuine. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. Please come in." Thomas stepped inside. The house smelled like coffee and old wood and something floral he couldn't name. The living room was to the left. Couch, armchair, coffee table with a half-finished crossword puzzle and a pen. Photos on the mantel, a quilt draped over the back of the couch, everything clean and lived in and unpretentious. Margaret gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." She led him through the living room to a small kitchen with white cabinets and a window over the sink that looked out onto a backyard with a vegetable garden. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been made an hour ago, handed him one. "Cream? Sugar?" "Black is fine." She nodded and led him to a small dining table by the window. They sat across from each other. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug the same way she'd held her purse yesterday, like it was something to anchor herself to. "Mr. Mitchell, I'll be direct with you because I think you're the kind of man who appreciates directness." "I am. My husband William passed away 5 years ago. He founded Garcia Industrial Supply in 1987, started as a warehouse loader, worked his way up, saved every dollar he could, and eventually bought his own place. Built it into something solid. Not a fortune, but enough." She paused, looked into her coffee. "When he died, he left me comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable. He also left me a commercial building at 1420 Commerce Drive, 8,000 square feet. It was going to be an expansion for the supply business, but he got sick before that could happen. The building's been sitting empty for 4 years. I haven't known what to do with it." Thomas set his coffee down, didn't trust his hands to stay steady. Margaret looked at him. "Yesterday I drove past your shop by accident. Or maybe not by accident. I'd been meaning to get the car looked at for 2 weeks. Every mechanic I called wanted to charge me a diagnostic fee just to tell me what was wrong. I got tired of it. So when I saw White's Auto, I pulled in." She took a sip of coffee. "You treated me like I mattered. Not like a problem. Not like a transaction. Like a person. And when I pretended I'd forgotten my wallet, you let me leave with my dignity intact. You didn't push. You didn't make me feel small. You just let me go." Thomas didn't say anything. Didn't know what to say. "That told me everything I needed to know about who you are." Margaret set her mug down and folded her hands on the table. "I called White's Auto yesterday afternoon to thank the manager. The woman who answered told me you no longer worked there. When I asked why, she was happy to explain. Said you'd been fired for giving away free service. Said you needed to learn how business worked." Thomas looked out the window at the vegetable garden. Tomatoes staked and tied. Neat rows of something green he couldn't identify from here. "Mr. Mitchell, I have a proposal for you. I'd like to offer you the building at 1420 Commerce Drive. The terms are simple. You rent it from me for $1 a month for the first year. I provide $50,000 in startup capital. You use that money for equipment, supplies, utilities, whatever you need to open a shop. You pay me back over 4 years, no interest. You run the business however you see fit. I don't interfere, I don't manage, I don't second guess. It's yours." Thomas looked at her and couldn't speak. His throat had closed up and his chest had gone tight, and he was 58 years old sitting in a stranger's kitchen being offered something that didn't make sense. "Why?" The word came out rough. Margaret smiled, sad and warm at the same time. "My husband used to say you can teach a man skills, but you can't teach him character. I watched you for 40 minutes yesterday. You didn't know I was watching. You didn't know who I was. You had nothing to gain, and you still did the right thing." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her skin was thin and cool, and her grip was firm. "William started with nothing. Worked as a loader for 15 years before he could afford to open his own place. He built Garcia Supply on one principle: honest work deserves honest service. He believed that a man's character mattered more than his resume, and he spent 30 years looking for people who still understood that." She pulled her hand back and picked up her coffee again. "You remind me of him, Mr. Mitchell, and this building has been sitting empty for 4 years because I couldn't find anyone I wanted to give it to. Now I have." Thomas looked at his coffee, looked at Margaret, looked at the garden outside the window. "Ma'am, I appreciate this more than I can say. But I need to ask, what if I fail? What if the shop doesn't work? What if I can't pay you back?" "Then you can't pay me back, and we'll figure out what comes next. But I don't think you're going to fail, Mr. Mitchell. Men like you don't fail because you don't know how to quit." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, something older and heavier. The weight of a door opening after you'd spent years believing all the doors were locked. "I'll need time to think about this. I'll need to see the building. I'll need to talk to someone I trust." "Of course. Take all the time you need." Margaret stood and walked to the counter, pulled a small envelope from a drawer and handed it to him. This is the key to 1420 Commerce Drive. Go look at it today, tomorrow, whenever you're ready. Walk the floor, get a feel for the space. Then call me and let me know what you decide. Thomas took the envelope, put it in his shirt pocket next to the folded photograph of Linda, stood up. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, for the coffee, for the offer, for all of it. You're welcome, Mr. Mitchell, and please, call me Margaret. She walked him to the door, shook his hand. Her grip was firm and brief and honest. Thomas walked to his truck and got in and sat there with the engine off, holding the steering wheel, staring at Margaret Wilson's blue door. Then he pulled the envelope out of his pocket and opened it, a single silver key on a plain ring. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the teeth, the weight of it. Then he started the truck and drove east toward Commerce Drive. The building at 1420 was exactly what Margaret had described. Single story, wide lot, good street frontage. The lot was empty except for leaves blown against the base of two big roll-up bay doors. The fascia above the entrance was blank where a sign had been removed. The windows were intact. The roof looked new or close to it. The landscaping was overgrown but not dead. Thomas parked and sat for a minute looking at it. Then he got out, walked to the front door, and unlocked it. Inside was a small waiting area with a counter, chairs along one wall, windows facing the lot. Dusty but structurally sound. He pushed through the door to the shop floor. 8 bays. He counted twice. Lifts in each bay, 4 2-post, 4 4-post. Good brands. Mid-range but reliable. Tool storage along the back wall. Parts area in the corner that would need reorganization. Overhead lighting, fluorescent, the kind that showed you exactly what you were working on. The air smelled stale, like a space that had been closed too long, but underneath that he could smell motor oil and concrete and possibility. He walked the floor slowly, all the way to the back, all the way around. Stood in the middle of the space and looked at the ceiling, at the bays, at the parts area, at the entrance visible through the glass. He thought about what it would sound like in here when it was running. Compressors, ratchets, voices. The radio someone would put on that everyone would complain about but nobody would change. He thought about Robert Williams. Thought about calling him tonight and asking if he wanted to leave White's and come run this floor. Thought about what Robert would say when Thomas told him the whole story. He thought about Emily, about telling her she could go back to school full-time because he wasn't going to need her help anymore. About watching her graduate. About Linda not being there to see it but somehow being there anyway, in the fact that Thomas was standing in this building because he'd done what she'd taught him to do. He pulled his phone out and took a photo of the empty shop floor. Then he walked back to the entrance, locked the door behind him, and got in his truck. He drove home and sat at his kitchen table and called Margaret Wilson. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mitchell?" "Margaret, I saw the building." "And?" "I'll need a lawyer to look at the terms. I'll need to make sure I understand everything I'm signing. But I'd like to move forward." There was a pause. Then, "I'm glad, Mr. Mitchell. Truly. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork. Should have it to you by end of week." "Thank you." "No, thank you. William would have liked you very much." They hung up. Thomas sat at the table with his phone in his hand, staring at the wall, trying to absorb what had just happened. Then he called Emily. She answered after 3 rings. "Hey, Uncle Thomas, what's up?" "Hey, honey, you got a minute?" "Yeah, just finished studying. What's going on? You sound weird." Thomas looked at the photo of Linda on the mantel. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm done, okay?" "Okay. You're scaring me a little. Don't be scared. Just listen." And he told her everything. Emily's voice came through the phone quiet at first, like she was trying to process the words in the order Thomas had given them to her. Then she said his name, once, and the way she said it made something crack open in his chest that he'd been holding closed for 6 years. "Uncle Thomas, are you serious?" "I'm serious. You got fired yesterday and today someone offered you a building?" "That's what happened." Silence on her end. He could hear her breathing, Could picture her sitting on the edge of her dorm bed with her textbooks spread out around her, trying to make sense of a story that didn't follow any logic she'd been taught. Why would she do that? She doesn't even know you. She watched me for 40 minutes. That was enough. Emily was quiet again. Then, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do it. But I need to see a lawyer first. Need to make sure the terms are what she says they are. Need to understand what I'm signing." "Do you have a lawyer?" "I'll find one." Another pause. "How much does she want you to pay back?" $50,000 over 4 years, no interest." "That's real money, Uncle Thomas." "I know." "What if it doesn't work? What if the shop doesn't make enough?" Thomas looked out the window at the backyard, at the grass he still needed to mow, at the fence Linda had helped him build in 2007 when they still thought they'd have kids to keep in the yard. "Then it doesn't work. But I'll have tried, and trying's better than sitting at White's for another 12 years, waiting for Deborah to decide I'm too expensive to keep around." Emily didn't say anything for a beat. Then, "Aunt Linda would be proud of you." Thomas closed his eyes. "She'd say I'm crazy. She'd say you're brave. Same thing sometimes." Emily laughed, small and surprised. "Yeah, same thing sometimes." They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important, the way people do when the important thing has already been said, and they're just filling the space until they can hang up without it feeling abrupt. After they said goodbye, Thomas sat at the table for a while, turning his phone over in his hands, thinking about what came next. He needed a lawyer. Needed someone who could read the paperwork Margaret's attorney would draw up and tell him if there were traps hidden in the language, clauses that looked reasonable on the surface but could bury him later. He opened his phone and searched for contract attorneys in the area, found 3 with decent reviews, called the first one, got a receptionist who said the earliest appointment was 2 weeks out, called the second one, got voicemail, called the third one, a man named Richard Miller who had an office above a tax preparation service on Dunmore Street. Miller answered his own phone. Richard Miller. "Mr. Miller, my name is Thomas Mitchell. I'm looking for someone to review a contract. It's for a commercial lease and a loan agreement. Wondering if that's something you handle." "It is." "When do you need this done?" "Soon as possible. The paperwork should be ready by end of week." "Can you come in Monday? I've got a slot at 2. "I'll be there." Miller gave him the address and they hung up. Thomas marked it in his phone calendar, Monday 2 p.m., and set the phone down. One problem handled. 50 more to think about. He spent the rest of Thursday cleaning the house because cleaning the house was something to do, and sitting still felt impossible. Vacuumed the living room, scrubbed the bathroom, wiped down the kitchen counters, took out the trash, changed the sheets on his bed even though they didn't need changing, worked until his back started complaining, and then worked another hour anyway because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant worrying and worrying didn't solve anything. By the time he finished, it was almost 7. He made dinner, ate standing at the counter, washed the dishes, and went to bed early. Lay there staring at the ceiling, running through the math. $50,000 for equipment, supplies, utilities, his own $22,000 for payroll and unexpected costs. Emily's tuition was $18,000. That left him $4,000 for himself, $4,000 to live on while he built something from nothing. It wasn't enough, but it was what he had. He thought about calling Robert, thought about asking if he'd be willing to leave White's and take a chance on a shop that didn't exist yet. Thought about what he'd say if Robert asked him why he should walk away from a steady paycheck to work for a man who'd just gotten fired for giving away free labor. He didn't call. Not yet. First he needed to see the paperwork. Needed to know this was real before he started pulling other people into it. Friday morning he woke early, made coffee, and drove back to Commerce Drive. Parked in front of 1420 and sat there drinking the coffee, looking at the building in the early light. Tried to imagine the sign that would go above the entrance. Tried to imagine customers pulling into the lot, walking through the door, trusting him with their cars and their money. Tried to imagine himself at 58 starting over with nothing but a key and a promise from a woman he'd met 2 days ago. The doubt came in waves. Big ones. The kind that made his hands sweat and his chest tighten. He was 58. He had bad knees and a lower back that seized up if he bent the wrong way. He didn't know how to run a business. He knew how to fix cars. That was it. Fixing cars and running a business were not the same thing, and pretending they were would get him buried in debt inside a year. But the other voice was there too, quieter, harder to hear over the doubt. The voice that sounded like Linda, the voice that said, "Men like you don't quit because you don't know how." The voice that said, "This door opened because you did the right thing when nobody was watching, and maybe that's worth something." He finished the coffee, got out of the truck, and unlocked the building again, walked through the waiting area to the shop floor, stood in Bay 3 and looked at the lift, at the concrete beneath it, at the fluorescent lights overhead. Then he pulled out his phone and started making a list. Equipment needed: diagnostic scanner, air compressor, tire machine, brake lathe, alignment rack. Tools: full socket sets, torque wrenches, pullers, specialty tools for imports. Supplies: oil, filters, brake pads, belts, hoses, fluids. Inventory system: accounting software, uniforms, shop rags, cleaning supplies, first aid kit, fire extinguisher, liability insurance, business license, signage. The list got longer. Every item he wrote down revealed 3 more he hadn't thought of. By the time he stopped, his thumb was cramping and he'd filled 2 pages in his phone's notes app, and he still wasn't done. He locked up and drove to the public library, spent 2 hours at a computer researching small business requirements in the state, business insurance, OSHA regulations, environmental compliance for auto shops. Printed out 20 pages of information he didn't fully understand but knew he'd need to understand eventually. Left the library with a headache and a folder full of paper and the growing certainty that he was in over his head. That night he sat at the kitchen table and called his sister in Oregon. Rachel answered on the 3rd ring. "Tommy, everything okay?" "Everything's fine. Got a question for you." "Shoot." "If someone offered you a building and $50,000 to start a business, would you take it?" Rachel was quiet for a beat. "Is this hypothetical?" "No." "Then I need more information." Thomas told her the whole story. Margaret Wilson, the test at White's, the firing, the phone call, the building on Commerce Drive. When he finished, Rachel didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. "Tommy, this sounds too good to be true." "I know." "Which means it probably is." "Maybe. Or maybe this woman is exactly who she says she is and you're about to get the break you've been waiting for your whole life." Thomas rubbed his eyes. "That's the problem. I don't know which one it is. So get a lawyer, have them read everything. If it's legitimate, you do it. If it's not, you walk away. But Tommy, if this is real and you don't do it because you're scared, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing that mattered, and then said goodbye. Thomas sat at the table afterward thinking about what Rachel had said, about regret, about the rest of his life, about how many years he had left to do something that mattered, and whether 58 was too late or exactly the right time. Saturday morning, Margaret's attorney called. Name was David Chen, pleasant voice, professional. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm calling on behalf of Margaret Wilson. I've prepared the lease agreement and loan terms we discussed. I can email them to you or meet in person if you prefer." "I'd like to meet in person, and I'll have my own attorney present if that's all right." "Of course, that's appropriate. Does Monday work?" "Monday I'm meeting with my attorney to review the documents. Could we do Tuesday?" "Tuesday at 10 works for me. I'll send the documents to your email this afternoon so you and your attorney have time to review them beforehand." "Thank you." "Mr. Mitchell, one more thing. Mrs. Wilson asked me to tell you she's very much looking forward to working with you." "Tell her I appreciate that." They hung up. Thomas spent the rest of Saturday doing yard work because yard work didn't require thinking. Mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedges, pulled weeds from the flower beds Linda used to plant. By the time he finished, his back was screaming, and his knee felt like someone had driven a nail through the joint, but the yard looked presentable, and he'd managed to not think about Commerce Drive for almost 3 hours. Sunday he went to church for the first time in 6 months. sat in the back pew at St. Anthony's, same church he and Linda had attended for 16 years. Listened to Father Morrison talk about faith and doubt and the hard work of trusting in things you couldn't see. After the service, Thomas lit a candle for Linda, knelt in front of it, and said the closest thing to a prayer he'd managed since she died. Didn't ask for anything, just said thank you. For the years they'd had, for Emily, for Margaret Wilson showing up when she did, for the possibility that maybe things happened for reasons even when the reasons didn't announce themselves until later. He left the church feeling lighter, not hopeful exactly, just less heavy. Monday at 2, he walked into Richard Miller's office above the tax service on Dunmore Street. The office was small, cluttered, comfortable. Law books stacked on every surface. A desk buried under case files. Miller himself was mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, shirt sleeves rolled up. He shook Thomas's hand and gestured to a chair across from the desk. "Mr. Mitchell, you said you've got a contract to review?" Thomas handed him his phone with the email from David Chen pulled up. Miller spent the next 45 minutes reading in silence, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, occasionally stopping to read a section twice. Thomas sat there trying not to fidget, watching Miller's face for some sign of what he was thinking. Finally, Miller set the phone down and looked at Thomas. "This is legitimate. More than legitimate. It's generous." Thomas felt something unclench in his chest. "No traps?" "2 sections I'd want to renegotiate. The exit terms, if the partnership dissolves, are vague. Right now they favor Mrs. Wilson in ways that could leave you vulnerable if things go south. And the definition of net operating income needs to be more specific. As written, you could end up in quarterly disputes about what counts as income and what doesn't. Can we get those changed?" "We can ask. If she's as straightforward as she seems, she'll agree. If she pushes back, that tells us something." "What do I owe you for this?" $300 for today, another 2 if we end up negotiating. But Mr. Mitchell, if this goes through, you hire me as your business attorney. I'll set up your LLC, handle your contracts, keep you out of legal trouble. Standard retainer is $500 a month. Thomas did the math in his head. $500 a month was $6,000 a year. That would come out of the $4,000 he had left after Emily's tuition, which meant he'd be in the red before he even opened the doors. Miller must have seen something in his face because he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands behind his head. "Or we do it different. I waive the retainer for the first year. You pay me hourly as needed. Once the shop's profitable, we revisit the arrangement. How's that sound?" "Why would you do that?" "Because 20 years ago I was sitting where you're sitting. Had an idea for a practice, no money to start it, and a lawyer who believed in me enough to work on contingency until I could pay him properly. I've been looking for a chance to return that favor ever since." Thomas looked at Miller and saw something honest in his face. "All right, let's do it." Miller nodded and stood up. "I'll send the red line to Mrs. Wilson's attorney this afternoon. We'll see what comes back." Thomas shook his hand and left. Drove home feeling like the ground under his feet was starting to solidify. One piece at a time. One decision that led to the next one. Tuesday morning, Miller called. They approved both changes. No pushback, no negotiation. Mrs. Wilson's attorney said she wants you to feel comfortable with every line. "That's it?" "That's it. We're meeting at her attorney's office this afternoon to sign. You available at 4? "I'll be there." At 3:45, Thomas pulled into the parking lot of a small office building on the north side of town. Miller was waiting outside, briefcase in hand. They walked in together, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and found David Chen's office at the end of the hall. Chen's office was bigger than Miller's, cleaner, more corporate. Chen himself was mid-40s, well-dressed, handshake firm, but not aggressive. Margaret Wilson sat in one of the chairs across from Chen's desk. She stood when Thomas entered and offered her hand. "Mr. Mitchell, good to see you again." "You too, Margaret." They all sat. Chen laid out 2 copies of the contract, one for Thomas and one for Margaret. Miller walked Thomas through each page, pointing out the sections they'd revised, making sure Thomas understood what he was signing. Thomas read slowly, taking his time, making sure every word made sense. When he got to the last page, he set the pen down and looked at Margaret. "Before I sign this, I need to ask you something." Margaret nodded. "Of course." "What happens if I fail? What happens if I can't pay you back?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Then you can't pay me back, and we'll figure out what comes next. But Mr. Mitchell, I don't believe you're going to fail. William spent 30 years looking for people worth investing in. He taught me how to recognize them, and I recognize you." Thomas picked up the pen, signed each page where Miller had marked with a yellow tab. Margaret signed opposite him. Chen witnessed. Miller witnessed. When it was done, Chen handed Thomas a copy of the contract and a check for $50,000 made out to Mitchell Automotive, LLC. Thomas stared at the check. $50,000. More money than he'd ever held in his hands at once. More money than Linda had made in 2 years working at the hospital. The weight of it made his hands shake. Margaret stood. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know something. William believed that you could teach a man skills, but you couldn't teach him character. He spent his whole life looking for people who had both, and he would have recognized that in you the same way I did." Thomas stood too. "I'll do right by this, Margaret, I promise you that." "I know you will." They shook hands again. Thomas left with Miller, walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel with the contract and the check on the seat next to him. Looked at his hands, looked at the check, looked at the building across the parking lot where Margaret Wilson's car was still parked. Then he drove to the bank. The teller who handled the deposit was young, maybe 25, and she looked at the check twice before processing it. $50,000 into an account that had held $22,000 that morning. She asked if he wanted it split into multiple accounts. He said no. She processed it and handed him a receipt and wished him a good day. Thomas walked out of the bank with the receipt folded in his wallet and got back in his truck. Sat there for 5 minutes trying to absorb the fact that he now had $72,000 and a building and a contract that said he had 4 years to turn it into something sustainable. He pulled out his phone and called Robert Williams. Robert answered on the second ring. "Tommy, how you holding up?" "Rob, you got a minute?" "Yeah, what's going on?" "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you answer." "All right." Thomas told him everything, about Margaret Wilson and the building and the $50,000 and the contract he'd just signed, about needing a foreman to run the shop floor while Thomas handled the business side, about not being able to match the money Deborah was paying him, at least not at first, but being able to offer him something whites never would, a chance to build something from the ground up. When Thomas finished, Robert didn't say anything for almost 15 seconds. "Tommy, Deborah called me Friday." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What did she say?" "Offered me your old supervisor position, $72,000 a year." Thomas closed his eyes. "That's good money, Rob. You should take it. She also said if I go with you, she'll blacklist me. Every supplier in 3 counties. She's got connections. She'll make it hard for both of us." "Then don't risk it. I'll figure something else out." Robert was quiet again. Then, 20 years ago, my daughter needed surgery. She was 10, had a tumor in her spine. Insurance wouldn't cover it because they said it was elective. Elective. Like my kid being able to walk was optional. Thomas remembered Robert coming to him with the hospital bill, $48,000, asking if Thomas knew any banks that would give a loan to a man with bad credit and no collateral. Remembered Thomas going to his own bank and taking out a personal loan for $12,000, every dollar he could borrow without Linda finding out. Remembered giving it to Robert and saying, "Don't worry about paying it back. Just pay it forward someday when you can." Robert's voice came through the phone rough. "You never asked for that money back, not once. You just said pay it forward." "Well, Tommy, today's someday. I'm coming with you. Deborah can keep her threats and her $72,000. I'd rather work for a man I trust than a woman who fires people for doing the right thing." Thomas couldn't speak. His throat had closed up and his eyes were burning, and he was sitting in a bank parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, trying not to lose it. "Tommy, you still there?" I'm here. So we doing this or what? We're doing this. Good. When do you need me? Soon as you can give notice. I'll tell Deborah tomorrow. 2 weeks, then I'm yours. They talked for another 10 minutes about logistics, about what the shop would need, about who else they might hire. When they hung up, Thomas sat in the truck with his hands on the wheel and let himself feel it. The weight lifting, the possibility opening, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. He drove home and called Emily. She answered on the first ring, voice bright. "Uncle Thomas, how'd it go?" "I signed the papers." Emily screamed. Actually screamed. Thomas had to pull the phone away from his ear. Oh my God, Uncle Thomas, this is incredible." "It's terrifying." "It's both. But you did it. You actually did it." They talked for a while longer, Emily asking questions faster than Thomas could answer them, her excitement spilling through the phone in a way that made his chest ache because it reminded him of Linda, of the way Linda used to get excited about things Thomas thought were impossible. After they hung up, Thomas made dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table, the contract spread out in front of him, reading through it again to make sure it was real. When he finished eating, he washed the dishes and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard in the fading light. The grass was mowed, the hedges were trimmed, everything in order. He went to the living room and sat on the couch and looked at Linda's photo on the mantel. Thought about what she'd say if she were here. She'd say, "You're crazy, Tommy." She'd say, "You're 58 years old with a bad back and you're starting a business from scratch." She'd say, "What happens if it doesn't work?" And then she'd smile and say, "But what happens if it does?" He sat there for a long time, looking at her picture, feeling her absence like a physical thing. Then he got up and went to the bedroom and pulled a box from the top shelf of the closet. The box held things from their marriage he hadn't been able to get rid of. Photos, cards, letters. At the bottom was the card she'd given him on their 10th anniversary. He opened it and read what she'd written. "Tommy, you're the best man I've ever known. Not because you're perfect, because you try. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying. I love you." He folded the card and put it back in the box. Put the box back on the shelf. Went to bed. Wednesday morning, Thomas drove to Commerce Drive and spent 4 hours measuring every bay, every wall, every inch of floor space. Made notes about electrical outlets, about the location of the airlines, about which lifts needed maintenance. Called 3 equipment suppliers and got quotes on diagnostic scanners, alignment racks, tire machines. Called 2 insurance brokers and got quotes on liability coverage. Called the city clerk's office and got the forms for a business license. Thursday he met with an accountant recommended by Richard Miller. The accountant's name was Patricia Vega, early 60s, no-nonsense demeanor. She walked him through setting up a business bank account, explained how payroll taxes worked, showed him how to use QuickBooks. By the end of the meeting, Thomas's head was spinning, but he had a clearer picture of what came next. Friday morning, he called Emily. "Honey, I need to talk to you about something." "What's up?" "Your tuition. I know it's due in 4 weeks." "Uncle Thomas, we talked about this. I'm taking the semester off. I've got the job at the hospital. I'm going to save up and go back in the fall." "No, you're not." Emily was quiet. "What?" "You're not taking the semester off. I'm paying your tuition." "With what money? You just put everything into the shop." "With the money I set aside for you before I signed anything. 18,000. It's in an account with your name on it. I'm transferring it to the school on Monday." "Uncle Thomas, you can't." "I can and I did. This shop is happening because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You offered to give up your education so I could chase this. I'm not letting you do that. You're going back to school full-time and you're finishing your degree, and that's the end of the discussion." Emily didn't say anything. Thomas could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the small hitch that meant she was trying not to cry. "Uncle Thomas, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll finish. Promise me you'll graduate. That's all I need." "I promise." "Good." They talked for a few more minutes and then said goodbye. Thomas sat at the kitchen table afterward feeling the weight of what he'd just committed to. $18,000 gone. $4,000 left in his personal account. $72,000 in the business account that had to cover equipment, payroll, supplies, utilities, insurance, and everything else he hadn't thought of yet. The math didn't look good. But the math never looked good when you were building something from nothing. You just had to trust that doing the right thing would work out eventually, even when the numbers said otherwise. Saturday morning, Thomas woke at 5 and drove to Commerce Drive, spent the next 6 hours cleaning, swept every bay, mopped the floors, washed the windows, scrubbed the waiting area until the counter shone, cleaned the bathroom until it didn't look like it had been abandoned for 4 years. By the time he finished, his back was screaming and his hands were raw, but the building looked like a place people might actually want to bring their cars. Sunday, he drove to a sign shop in Westfield and sat down with a designer. Showed her a sketch he'd made on a napkin. Mitchell Automotive, in bold letters, service you can trust underneath in smaller font. The designer looked at it, made some adjustments, showed him a digital mock-up. Thomas approved it. She said it would be ready in 10 days. Monday morning, Robert Williams gave his notice at White's Auto. Deborah took it exactly the way Thomas expected. Badly. Robert called him afterward and told the story. How Deborah had accused him of being disloyal. How she'd told him he was making a mistake. How she'd said she'd make sure no supplier in 3 counties would work with him or Thomas. How Robert had listened to all of it and then said, "I've made my decision," and walked out. Tuesday morning, Brandon Flores showed up at Commerce Drive. Thomas was there installing shelving in the parts area when he heard a knock on the bay door. He walked over and opened it. Brandon stood there in a clean t-shirt and jeans, hands in his pockets, looking nervous. "Mr. Mitchell, got a minute?" "Sure, come in." Brandon stepped inside and looked around. Took in the bays, the lifts, the clean floors. "This is your place?" "It is." "Robert told me you're hiring. Said you need mechanics." Thomas set down the drill he'd been holding. "That's right." Brandon shifted his weight. "I've been clean 14 months. I know that doesn't mean much to most people, but it means something to me. I've been working at a quick lube place in Riverside making $11 an hour. I'm trying to build a life, trying to prove I'm not what everyone thinks I am." Thomas looked at Brandon and saw something honest in his face, saw the fear of rejection, saw the hope that maybe this time someone would say yes. "You ever done brake work?" "Yes, sir. Brakes, suspension, basic diagnostics. I'm not ASE certified yet, but I'm studying for it." "What's your sobriety program?" Brandon blinked. Didn't expect the question. 12-step. I've got a sponsor. Been going to meetings 3 times a week for over a year." Thomas nodded. "I'll pay you $16 an hour to start. Benefits after 90 days. You show up on time, you do good work, and you stay clean. We'll talk about raises. But Brandon, I need you to understand something. If you relapse, I'll help you get into treatment. But you can't work here while you're using. That's non-negotiable." Brandon's eyes went bright. "You serious?" "I'm serious. Why would you take a chance on me? You don't even know me." Thomas thought about Linda, about Father Morrison's sermon, about Margaret Wilson watching him for 40 minutes and deciding that was enough. "Because somebody took a chance on me when I didn't deserve it. Now I'm taking a chance on you. Don't make me regret it." Brandon's hands were shaking. "I won't. I swear to God I won't." "Good. Can you start next week?" "I can start today." Thomas almost smiled. "Next Monday's fine. Be here at 7. Brandon left and Thomas went back to installing shelving. His hands were steadier than they'd been in days. That afternoon the sign company called. The sign was ready early. Thomas drove to Westfield and picked it up, loaded it into his truck, drove back to Commerce Drive. Called Robert and asked if he could come help install it. Robert showed up 20 minutes later with a ladder and a drill. They spent the next 2 hours mounting the sign above the entrance. Mitchell Automotive in bold black letters on a white background, service you can trust underneath. When they finished, they stood in the parking lot looking at it. The sun was starting to set, and the light hit the sign at an angle that made the letters stand out sharp and clear. Robert crossed his arms. Looks good, Tommy. Yeah, it does. You scared? Terrified. Good. Means you're taking it seriously. They stood there for another minute, not talking, just looking at the sign. Then Robert clapped Thomas on the shoulder and said he'd see him Monday and drove away. Thomas stayed. Stood in the empty parking lot as the sun went down and the streetlights came on. Pulled out his phone and took a photo of the sign. Sent it to Emily. She replied with 3 heart emojis and a message. Aunt Linda would be so proud. Thomas looked at the message for a long time. Then he put the phone away and walked back to his truck. Got in. Sat there with his hands on the wheel, looking at the sign one more time. Then he drove home to get ready for Monday. Monday morning came cold and clear, one of those October days where the air had teeth and the sun didn't warm anything until noon. Thomas unlocked the bay doors at 6:30, turned on the lights, and stood in the center of the shop floor listening to the hum of the fluorescents. Empty bays, clean concrete, the smell of simple green and possibility. Robert showed up at 6:45 with 2 coffees from the diner down the street. Brandon arrived at 6:58, 2 minutes early, keys in hand like he was afraid if he was late the whole thing would disappear. They stood in Bay 3, and Thomas laid it out. We've got 12 customers booked for the first week. Oil changes, brake jobs, basic maintenance. Nothing fancy. Robert, you're running the floor. Brandon, you're taking direction from Robert. I'm handling walk-ins and the business side. We keep the waiting area clean. We keep the bays organized. We call customers when their cars are ready instead of making them call us. And we do good work, not fast work, good work. Questions? Robert shook his head. Brandon looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know what. Then let's get started. The first customer pulled in at 7:15, a woman named Janet Ramirez with a Honda Civic that needed an oil change and a tire rotation. Thomas handled the intake while Robert and Brandon prepped Bay 1. The work took 30 minutes. Thomas called Mrs. Ramirez when it was done and she came back an hour later to pick it up. Paid cash. Thanked them 3 times, said she'd be back. The second customer showed up at 9. A man with a Ford F-150 making a grinding noise when he turned left. Robert diagnosed it in 10 minutes. Power steering pump failing. Gave the customer an estimate. The customer approved. They had the part in stock because Thomas had ordered a broad inventory and the pump was common. Robert and Brandon did the work together, Brandon watching, asking questions, Robert explaining each step. The truck was done by noon. By the end of the first week, they'd serviced 19 vehicles, 3 more than Thomas had projected. Revenue was just over $2,000 after parts costs. Not enough to cover payroll and overhead, but enough to prove people would come. Thomas paid Robert and Brandon at the end of the week, cut the checks himself, handed them over in person. Robert folded his and put it in his wallet without looking at the amount. Brandon stared at his for a full 10 seconds before saying thank you in a voice that sounded like he'd forgotten what getting paid for honest work felt like. Week 2 brought 23 vehicles. Week 3 brought 28. By the end of the first month, Mitchell Automotive had serviced 87 cars and trucks, generated $11,000 in revenue, and burned through $9,000 in operating costs. $2,000 in the black. Thomas wrote the numbers in a ledger every night at the kitchen table, double-checking his math, making sure he wasn't missing anything. The margins were thin, razor thin, but they were there. The second month brought complications. A customer named Bill Harris came in with a Chevy Silverado that needed a transmission flush. Standard job. Robert did the work, Brandon assisted, everything went according to procedure. 2 days later, Harris called screaming. The truck was slipping gears, wouldn't go into reverse. He wanted his money back and he wanted them to fix whatever they'd broken. Thomas drove to Harris's house, looked at the truck, crawled underneath. The transmission pan was leaking, not from the work they'd done, from a crack in the pan itself, a crack that looked old, that had probably been seeping for months. Thomas showed Harris, explained that the flush hadn't caused the crack, it had just revealed a problem that was already there. Harris didn't want to hear it, accused Thomas of lying, said he was going to leave a review online telling everyone Mitchell Automotive broke his truck. Thomas stood in Harris's driveway with grease on his hands and the sun going down and made a decision. Mr. Harris, I'll fix the transmission pan at cost. No labor charge. You pay for the part. That's it. But I need you to understand something. We didn't break your truck. We found a problem you didn't know you had. I'm fixing it anyway because I want you to trust us. But if you leave a bad review over something we didn't cause, I won't be able to help you next time." Harris looked at him for a long time. Then he said fine. Thomas ordered the part, had it shipped overnight, came in on Saturday to install it himself. Harris picked up the truck on Sunday. Didn't say thank you, didn't leave a review either. Robert found out what Thomas had done on Monday morning. "You fixed that guy's pan for free?" "For cost. He paid for the part." "Tommy, we can't afford to eat jobs every time someone blames us for something we didn't do." "I know, but we also can't afford bad reviews when we're 2 months old. People trust reviews more than they trust us. We build trust by proving we're not like every other shop." Robert didn't argue, but his face said he thought Thomas was being too generous. Maybe he was, but generosity was the only currency Thomas knew how to spend when the alternative was letting someone think he'd cheated them. Week 6 brought a different problem. Brandon didn't show up for work on Monday. Didn't call, didn't text. Thomas tried his phone 3 times, got voicemail, left messages. Tuesday morning, same thing. No Brandon. Robert covered his work, but the shop was understaffed and 2 jobs ran long because of it. Wednesday morning, Thomas drove to the address Brandon had put on his intake paperwork. A small apartment complex in Riverside, 2nd floor, paint peeling on the exterior stairwell. Thomas knocked on 2B. Heard movement inside. Knocked again. The door opened 6 inches, chain still attached. Brandon stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, eyes red, face pale. "Mr. Mitchell." "Brandon, you missed 3 days." "I know. I'm sorry. You coming to work today?" Brandon looked at the floor. "I can't." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Why not?" "I relapsed. 48 hours ago. I'm trying to get clean again, but I'm not there yet." Thomas stood in the hallway outside Brandon's apartment and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could fire Brandon right now. Had every reason to. 3 days, no call, no show, showing up to work high was grounds for immediate termination. It was in the employee handbook Richard Miller had helped him write. But he looked at Brandon standing there with the chain on the door, shame written all over his face, and heard Linda's voice in his head saying, "People deserve second chances, Tommy, especially when they're trying." "You got a sponsor?" "Yeah." "You called him?" "Not yet." "Call him, right now, while I'm standing here." Brandon stared at him. "What?" "Call your sponsor. Tell him what happened. Then pack a bag. Mr. Mitchell, I can't afford rehab. I don't have insurance. And you need me at the shop. I know you're short-handed. Brandon, I'm going to say this once. You're not coming back to work until you're clean. But I'm not firing you either. I'm sending you to a 30-day inpatient program. I'll pay for it. You focus on getting well. When you're done, your job's waiting." Brandon's face did something complicated. Disbelief, relief, shame, gratitude, all at once. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Thomas thought about the $72,000 in the business account, about the diagnostic scanner he'd planned to buy this month, about how sending Brandon to rehab meant that purchase would have to wait. Thought about Margaret Wilson fixing his car for free, about Father Morrison saying faith means trusting things you can't see, about Linda saying you can replace equipment but you can't replace people. "Because I made you a promise. I said if you relapsed, I'd help you get treatment. I keep my promises. Now call your sponsor." Brandon pulled out his phone with shaking hands, made the call, explained what happened, listened, said okay, hung up. "He's coming over. Says he'll help me pack." "Good. When he gets here, have him call me. I'll get you checked in today." Thomas left and drove back to the shop. Told Robert what happened. Robert's face went tight. "Tommy, we can't run this place with 2 people. We're already behind." "I know. And you're spending what? 7,000? 8? On rehab for a kid who's been here 2 months? 7,200. That's the scanner money. I know what it is. Robert looked at him like he was trying to decide if Thomas had lost his mind. What happens if he relapses again? Then we deal with that when it happens. But Rob, I told that kid I'd help him if he needed it. If I don't follow through, I'm no different than every other boss who says the right things and does nothing. And if I'm no different, why would anyone work for me? Robert didn't answer, just shook his head and went back to Bay 2 where a Subaru Outback was waiting for new brake pads. Thomas spent the rest of the morning calling rehab facilities. Found one in Greenfield that had an open bed, cost $7,200 for 28 days. He gave them his credit card number over the phone, winced when the charge went through. Brandon's sponsor called an hour later. Thomas gave him the address. The sponsor said he'd have Brandon there by 3. That afternoon, Thomas worked alone in Bay 4 on an alignment job while Robert handled an engine diagnostic in Bay 2. They got through the day, barely. By closing time, Thomas's back was screaming and his hands were cramping, and he knew they couldn't keep this pace for a month. Thursday morning, he put an ad on Craigslist. Experienced mechanic wanted. Mitchell Automotive, Commerce Drive. $16 an hour to start. Benefits after 90 days. Must have clean driving record and references. He got 7 responses by Friday. Interviewed 3 on Saturday. Hired none of them. 1 showed up late. 1 didn't know the difference between a brake caliper and a rotor. 1 spent the entire interview asking about days off and whether Thomas provided uniforms. The following Monday, a woman walked into the shop at 7:15. She was maybe 24, white, wearing coveralls that had seen serious use, grease under her fingernails, work boots with steel toes. She walked straight to Thomas at the front desk and set down a folder. "I'm here about the mechanic position." Thomas opened the folder. Inside was a resume. Nicole Torres, age 24, certified by a technical college in Ohio, 2 years experience at a Chevy dealership, ASE certified in brakes and suspension. At the bottom, handwritten, 11 months clean, NA member, looking for a second chance. Thomas looked up at her. "You drove from Ohio?" "I did. Heard about what you did for Brandon Flores, how you sent him to rehab instead of firing him. Figured maybe you'd be willing to give me a shot." "How'd you hear about that?" "His sponsor's in my network. Word gets around in recovery communities." Thomas set the resume down. "Tell me why you want to work here." Nicole looked him in the eye. "Because I'm trying to build a life. I've been clean 11 months and I need a job where I won't get fired the minute someone finds out I'm in recovery. I'm good with my hands. I'm reliable. I'll work whatever hours you need. And I'm not asking for special treatment. Just a chance to prove I'm more than my worst days." Thomas thought about Brandon sitting in his apartment with withdrawal symptoms. Thought about Linda saying the world needs more places where people can start over. Thought about how the shop was drowning without a third mechanic and how he couldn't afford to be picky. "You got a place to stay?" "Motel off Route 9. I can find something more permanent if I get the job." "You start today. Trial period is 90 days. You stay clean, show up on time, do good work. The job's yours permanent. You relapse. Same deal as Brandon. I'll help you get treatment, but you can't work here while you're using. Understood?" Nicole's face broke into something that might have been a smile if she'd let it all the way through. "Understood." Robert came out of Bay 1 and stopped when he saw Nicole. Thomas introduced them. Robert shook her hand, looked at Thomas with a question in his eyes that said, "Are you sure about this?" Thomas gave him a look back that said no, but we're doing it anyway. Nicole worked Bay 3 that first day, handled an oil change on a Toyota Camry, then a coolant flush on a Dodge Ram, then a full brake job on a Ford Escape. Worked clean, worked fast, didn't waste motion. By the end of the day, Robert pulled Thomas aside and said wherever you found her, find 3 more just like her. That week the shop serviced 34 vehicles. Revenue hit $4,000. Thomas paid Nicole her first check on Friday, and she looked at it like she'd never seen money before. "This is real? It's real. You're really going to let me keep working here? Long as you show up and do the job, yeah." She folded the check and put it in her pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Call me Thomas." Week 8 brought the first wave of repeat customers. Mrs. Ramirez came back for another oil change. Bill Harris returned for a tire rotation, didn't complain, paid on time. A man named Carl Delaney, who'd brought in a Nissan Sentra for a timing belt, brought in his wife's Honda Pilot for new struts. Said he'd been telling his neighbors about Mitchell Automotive. Said he liked that Thomas called him when the car was ready instead of making him wait. By the end of month 3, the shop had serviced 218 vehicles. Revenue was averaging $5,000 a week. Payroll was eating $2,400. Overhead was eating $1,800. Parts were eating $1,200. That left Thomas with $900 a week profit, $3,600 a month. Not enough to pay back Margaret yet, but enough to prove the model worked. Month 4 started slow. 2 customers canceled because of bad weather. A supplier delayed an order, which pushed back 3 jobs. Then on a Tuesday morning in the middle of week 14, Deborah White pulled into the parking lot in her van. Thomas saw her through the bay door, watched her get out and stand there looking at the sign, at the shop, at the 3 bays that were occupied and running. She walked to the entrance and came inside. Thomas met her at the front desk. "Deborah?" "Thomas." She looked around. Clean waiting area, fresh coffee brewing, magazines that weren't 3 years old. "Place looks good." "Thank you. I lost 9 regulars to you. The Washingtons, the Carvalhos, Tom Delaney, Bill Harris, Janet Ramirez, 4 others. They all said the same thing. They trust you." Thomas didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Deborah set an envelope on the counter. "This is $92. The parts from that morning. I told you I'd dock your check, but I never did. I don't want it in my business. It doesn't belong there." Thomas picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it. "Why are you here, Deborah?" "Because I was wrong." The words came out flat but honest. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about how to run a shop. I was wrong about what makes customers loyal. And I came here to tell you that to your face because you deserve to hear it in person." Thomas set the envelope down. "Deborah, White's Auto is a good shop. Your grandfather built something solid. You just got focused on the wrong things for a while. Doesn't mean the foundation isn't still there. It's not the same without you. Or Robert. Even without that kid Brandon. The shop runs, but it doesn't feel right anymore. Then fix it. You know how. Treat people like they matter. Both customers and employees. That's all it takes." Deborah looked at him, and something in her face shifted. Not quite regret. Not quite respect. Something in between. "I also came to offer you something. Come back to White's. Supervisor position. $75,000 a year. You'd be running the floor, managing the team. I'd handle the business side." Thomas looked at her and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just the quiet certainty that he'd already made his choice and there was no going back. "I appreciate the offer, but I work for myself now, and I work with people who believed in me when I had nothing. That's not something I can walk away from." Deborah nodded slow, like she'd expected that answer. "Take care of yourself, Thomas." "You too." She left. Thomas picked up the envelope and walked to the back office, sat at the desk and opened it. $92 in cash. He thought about Margaret Wilson and the $50,000 she'd given him. Thought about Robert taking an $8,000 pay cut to work here. Thought about Brandon in rehab fighting to get clean. Thought about Nicole driving from Ohio because she'd heard this was a place where second chances meant something. Late that afternoon, Mrs. Linda Harris came in with her Corolla. Same woman whose husband Bill had accused them of breaking his transmission. She needed a fuel pump. $420. Thomas saw her face when Robert gave her the estimate and recognized the look. The math that didn't work. The choice between fixing the car and paying some other bill. Thomas pulled Robert aside. "Apply $92 to her bill. Tell her it's a senior discount." "Where's that money coming from?" Thomas handed him the envelope from Deborah. Someone who finally understood. Robert didn't ask questions, just took the money and adjusted the invoice. Mrs. Harris picked up the car that evening, looked at the bill, looked at Thomas. "This says senior discount. I'm only 56. Shop policy, 55 and older." "That's very kind of you." "You're welcome, ma'am." She left and Thomas locked up for the night. Drove home thinking about how money moved in circles, about how sometimes the best thing you could do with it was let it keep moving. Month 5 brought stability. The shop was servicing 40 vehicles a week. Revenue was steady, payroll was covered, overhead was covered. Thomas was pulling $1,800 a week profit, $7,200 a month, enough to start thinking about paying Margaret back ahead of schedule. Then week 19 arrived and Brandon came back. He walked into the shop on a Monday morning, clean-shaven, eyes clear, wearing the same coveralls he'd left in. Stood just inside the bay door like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. Thomas walked over from the office. "Brandon?" "Mr. Mitchell, I'm 32 days clean, just finished the program. My sponsor says I'm ready to work again." He paused. "If you'll still have me." Thomas looked at him and saw something different than the kid who'd shown up 4 months ago looking for a second chance. Saw someone who'd fought for something and won. "Bay 4 needs an oil change. Get to work." Brandon's shoulders dropped like he'd been holding his breath for a month. "Yes, sir." He worked that day like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to have purpose. Careful, deliberate, present. At the end of the shift, Thomas paid him for the day and told him his position was permanent if he wanted it. Brandon's hands shook when he took the check. The shop ran smooth after that. 4 mechanics, 30 to 40 cars a week, steady revenue. Thomas paid himself a salary for the first time in month 6, $2,400 a week. Not what he'd made at White's, but enough to cover the mortgage and groceries and the slow accumulation of costs that came with being alive at 58. Month 7 brought the first payment to Margaret, $5,000, $5,000, 1/10 of what he owed. Thomas wrote the check on a Friday evening, put it in an envelope, drove to her house on Oakwood Drive. She opened the door and smiled when she saw him. "Thomas, come in." He handed her the envelope. "First payment, $5,000. I know the contract says I've got 4 years, but I'm ahead of schedule. Thought I'd start paying you back sooner." Margaret opened the envelope and looked at the check, set it on the table without much ceremony. "Thomas, I never doubted you'd pay me back. The question was never if. It was just when. I want you to know I'm going to keep paying ahead, every month, until it's done. I appreciate that. But Thomas, I also want you to know that if you need that money for the business, for equipment or emergencies, don't sacrifice the shop to pay me faster. The agreement was 4 years for a reason. I'll keep it in mind." They sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and talked about William, about the early years of Garcia Industrial Supply, about how he'd started with nothing and built something that outlasted him. Margaret's eyes got distant when she talked about him. Not sad, just elsewhere, in memories that still felt close enough to touch. When Thomas left, she walked him to the door and shook his hand. "You remind me of him more every time I see you." Thomas drove home thinking about legacy, about what it meant to build something that would outlast you, about whether Mitchell Automotive would still be there in 30 years, or if it would be gone and forgotten like most small businesses that burned bright and then disappeared. Month 8 brought winter, snow in December, ice in January. Business slowed. People put off maintenance when the weather turned. Revenue dropped to 30 cars a week. Thomas tightened expenses, cut his own salary to $2,200, made sure payroll and overhead were covered first. The profit margin shrank but held. Then, in the middle of January, Emily came home. She pulled into the driveway on a Saturday afternoon, got out of her car wearing scrubs, exhausted but smiling. Thomas met her at the door and she hugged him hard enough that his ribs protested. "I did it, Uncle Thomas. I graduated." Thomas held her and felt something in his chest give way. "I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you. You know that, right? Without the shop, without you paying my tuition, I'd still be a semester behind working at the hospital trying to save up. They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and Emily told him about her last semester, about clinicals, about passing her boards, about the job offer she'd accepted at St. Mary's Hospital starting in 2 weeks. Thomas listened and watched her face and saw Linda in the way she gestured when she got excited, in the way she laughed at her own stories, in the way she looked at the world like it was something worth being excited about. That night, after Emily went to bed, Thomas sat in the living room and looked at Linda's photo on the mantel. Thought about how she'd wanted kids, how they'd tried for 5 years and it hadn't worked, how they'd made peace with it, and then Linda's brother and his wife had died and suddenly Emily was theirs to raise. Thought about how Linda would sit at this same table and help Emily with homework, how she'd been there for every school play and science fair and bad day and good day until the cancer took her, and Thomas was left to finish what they'd started together. "We did it, Linda," he said to the photograph. "She graduated. She's going to be okay." The photo didn't answer, but he felt something settle in his chest anyway. The sense that he'd kept a promise, that Emily was launched into the world the way Linda had wanted, that some debts could actually be paid. Month 9 brought spring. Business picked up. 40 cars a week. Then 45. Then 50. Robert started training Nicole to handle more complex diagnostics. Brandon got his ASE certification. The shop was running so smooth, Thomas started thinking about expansion, about adding another bay, about maybe hiring a 5th mechanic. Then, on a Monday morning in April, a young woman walked into the shop carrying a resume. She was maybe 26, Latino, coveralls that had seen real work. She walked to the counter and set down the folder without saying anything. Thomas opened it. Maria Sanchez, age 26, technical school in New Mexico, 3 years experience, ASE certified in engine repair and electrical systems. At the bottom, handwritten, 10 months clean, AA member. Heard about Mitchell Automotive from Nicole Torres, looking for a place to rebuild my life. Thomas looked at her. She looked back steady, no apology in her eyes, just determination. "Nicole told you about us?" "She did. Said this is a place where people get second chances if they're willing to work for them. Said you sent Brandon Flores to rehab instead of firing him. Said you treat people like they're worth something." Thomas thought about the shop, about how it had started as one man with a toolbox and a building he didn't own, about how it had become something bigger than that, something that attracted people who were trying to become better than their worst decisions. Thought about how that hadn't been the plan, but maybe it was the point. "You got a place to stay?" "Motel on Route 9 for now." "You start tomorrow. Same deal as everyone else. Stay clean, show up, do good work. Trial period is 90 days. After that, we talk about making it permanent." Maria's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." "Thomas?" She nodded and left. Robert came out of Bay 2 and looked at Thomas. "Another one?" "Another one. Tommy, we're becoming a halfway house with hydraulic lifts." Thomas almost smiled. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Month 10 brought the moment Thomas had been building toward without realizing it. A Saturday morning in May. The shop was closed, but Thomas had come in to do paperwork. He was sitting in the office going through invoices when he heard a knock on the bay door. He walked over and opened it. Margaret Wilson stood there in a cardigan and slacks, same as the first time he'd met her. She smiled. "Thomas, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. Come in." She walked through the shop, looking at the bays, at the tools organized on the walls, at the clean floors and the sign above the entrance visible through the window. "It's remarkable what you've built here." "Couldn't have done it without you." "That's not true. You would have found another way. Men like you always do." They stood in Bay 3, and Margaret turned to face him. "Thomas, I came because I wanted to tell you something. William and I never had children. We tried. It didn't happen. So we poured everything into the business, into helping young people get started in trades, into trying to build something that would outlast us." She paused, looking at the shop. "When William died, I thought that purpose died with him. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with the building, with the money, with any of it. And then you walked into my life and reminded me what William spent 30 years teaching me, that the best investment you can make is in people who still believe doing the right thing matters. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Margaret, let me finish. I've watched you build this place. I've watched you hire people other shops wouldn't touch. I've watched you treat customers like they're worth your time even when they can't pay full price. I've watched you keep your word to people who gave you no reason to trust them. And I want you to know that's exactly what William would have done. You're not just running a business, Thomas. You're building something that matters. Don't ever lose sight of that. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, handed it to him. Thomas opened it. Inside was a check for $5,000 made out to Mitchell Automotive. What's this? Your last 3 payments. You've been paying me ahead of schedule. You've proven you're a man of your word. Consider the debt paid. Thomas stared at the check. Margaret, I still owe you $30,000. You don't owe me anything. You've already paid me back by being exactly who I thought you were. The money was never the point, Thomas. It was just the tool I had available to help you build what you needed to build. Thomas couldn't speak. His hands were shaking and his eyes were burning, and he was standing in the shop he'd built with a woman who'd bet on him when he was 58 and unemployed and terrified of hoping for anything. Margaret put her hand on his arm. William used to say the world runs on what people do when nobody's watching. You passed that test, Thomas, every single day. Don't stop now. She left. Thomas stood in the empty shop holding the check and thinking about Linda, about Father Morrison, about Robert and Brandon and Nicole and Maria and Emily, about how the line from that Wednesday morning at White's Auto to this Saturday morning at Mitchell Automotive was straight and clear and earned. He walked to the office and taped the check to the wall above his desk. Didn't cash it, just left it there as a reminder of what had started this whole thing, a single act of kindness for a stranger who turned out to be watching. That afternoon he drove home and called Emily, told her about Margaret, about the check, about the debt being forgiven. Emily cried, actually cried, said Aunt Linda would be so proud, Uncle Thomas, said you did it. You really did it. They talked until the sun went down and Thomas made dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table and looked at Linda's photo and said we did it. Not I. We. Month 12 brought the moment everything nearly fell apart. A Tuesday morning. Brandon didn't show up for work, didn't call, didn't answer his phone. Thomas felt his stomach drop because he knew what it meant before he let himself think it. He left Robert and Nicole and Maria to handle the shop and drove to Brandon's apartment. Knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again. The door opened a crack. Brandon stood there looking like death. Hollow eyes, shaking hands, the smell of something chemical and wrong drifting through the gap. Brandon. Mr. Mitchell. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Let me in. Brandon stepped back. Thomas walked into an apartment that looked like a disaster site. Fast food containers, empty bottles, needles on the coffee table. Brandon sat on the couch and put his face in his hands. How long? 3 days. Thomas sat on the other end of the couch, felt the disappointment like a physical weight, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded like Linda saying, people don't heal in straight lines, Tommy. They heal in circles, and sometimes they fall back before they can move forward. You call your sponsor? Not yet. Call him, right now. Brandon looked up. You're not firing me? I told you what would happen if you relapsed. I'm keeping my word. But Brandon, you're not working until you're clean, and this time it's 60 days inpatient. Not 30, 60, because 30 wasn't enough, and we both know it. Brandon's face crumpled. I can't afford that. I don't have the money. I do. And I'm using it. But Brandon, this is the last time. Not because I don't care. Because if 60 days doesn't work, you need a level of help I can't provide. Understood? Yes, sir. Then call your sponsor. Pack a bag. We're leaving in an hour. Thomas drove Brandon to a facility in Hartford, Cost $11,000 for 60 days. He paid it with the check Margaret had given him, the one he'd taped to his office wall. Thought about how money always seemed to find the place it was supposed to go if you let it. The shop ran short-handed for 2 months. Robert, Nicole, and Maria worked overtime. Thomas worked the floor more than the office. They managed. Barely. But they managed. Brandon came back in August, 62 days clean, walked into the shop with his head up and his hands steady and his eyes clear in a way they'd never been before. Thomas gave him his job back. Didn't make a speech about it. Just handed him a wrench and pointed to Bay 2. That night, Thomas drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and calculated where they stood. 12 months in business. 640 vehicles serviced. Revenue of $218,000. Expenses of $183,000. Net profit of $35,000. Not enough to get rich. Enough to prove it worked. He paid himself a bonus for the first time, $5,000. Put it in savings. Didn't spend it. Just wanted to see it there as proof that he'd made it through the first year without going under. The next morning he woke up and drove to the shop and opened the bay doors and turned on the lights and stood in the center of the floor thinking about what came next, about whether he could keep this going for another year, another 5, another 20, about what it would take to turn Mitchell Automotive into something that would outlast him the way Garcia Industrial Supply had outlasted William. At 7:15 a young man walked into the shop, maybe 28, white, work clothes that had seen better days. He walked to the counter and didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking nervous. Thomas walked over. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Thomas Mitchell." "That's me." The young man shifted his weight. "My name's Eric Palmer. I'm a mechanic. Been working at a tire shop in Bridgeport making $13 an hour. I heard about this place from Maria Sanchez. She said you hire people who are trying to build a life, said you gave her a chance when nobody else would." Thomas looked at Eric and saw the same thing he'd seen in Brandon and Nicole and Maria. The hope, the fear of rejection, the quiet desperation of someone who needed to prove they were worth more than the world had decided they were. "You clean?" 14 months. "You got references?" "One. My sponsor. Nobody else would hire me, so I don't have work references. Just him." Thomas thought about the shop, about the 4 bays that were constantly full, about how they'd turned away work last month because they didn't have capacity. Thought about Robert saying we need another mechanic if we're going to keep growing. Thought about Linda saying the world needs more places where people can start over. You start Monday. Trial period is 90 days. Show up on time, do good work, stay clean. After that, we talk about making it permanent. Eric's face did something that might have been relief or gratitude or disbelief. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." "Thomas." Eric nodded and left. Thomas stood at the counter watching him go, thought about how the shop had become something he hadn't planned but couldn't regret. A place where people went to fix cars and ended up fixing themselves. A place built on one simple idea, that doing the right thing when nobody's watching is the only thing that matters in the end. Robert came out of the office with a clipboard. "Another one?" "Another one." "Tommy, at this rate we're going to need a bigger building." Thomas looked at the bays, at the lifts, at the sign above the entrance, thought about the building Margaret had given him, about the $50,000 she'd forgiven, about how none of this had been the plan, but all of it had been exactly right. "Maybe we will, Rob. Maybe we will."